On the very day Claire Bennett first brought a pair of adult North American beavers to her ranch, a good half of the county came to the shared, unwavering conclusion that the prolonged drought had finally driven her completely out of her mind. Claire stood near the dry, dusty bed that only by some stubborn historical misunderstanding was still referred to on county maps as Bennett Creek. In reality, it was merely a sluggish, dusty, muddy brown scar across the cracked breast of the earth, a miserable chain of shallow, stagnant, lukewarm puddles trapped in the deepest bends of the terrain. Although the old cast-iron clock on the front porch had barely struck 9 in the morning, the intense July sun was already baking away whatever meager moisture had managed to survive the night. The rolling hills encircling the valley, clad in a brittle, bleached yellow mantle of dead pasture grass, looked like a massive, open-air powder keg. One stray spark from a passing pickup's exhaust, one discarded cigarette butt, or one flash of heat lightning, and the whole countryside would burst into an unstoppable, roaring prairie fire. Her closest neighbor, Roy, strapped as usual into a faded, oil-stained leather work belt and leaning heavily against a sun-bleached fence post on the far side of the gravel road, watched with narrowed eyes as heavy wooden crates were carefully unloaded from the back of an official state wildlife service truck. His weathered face bore a complex, unspoken mixture of deep astonishment, cynical amusement, and awkward, neighborly sympathy. "Claire!" he called out across the fence, shielding his eyes from the blinding glare with a calloused hand. "Tell me straight right now so I don't have to spend the rest of the week agonizing over it. This isn't what I think it is it?" Wiping a sticky, stingingly hot bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her dirty sleeve, Claire replied quietly, her voice steady despite the heat. "That entirely depends on what kind of wild nonsense you've managed to picture in your head, Roy." Her neighbor narrowed his eyes into tight slits. Inside the idling van, one of the heavy pine crates shifted with a sudden, dull thud. From its dark wooden interior came the distinct, frantic scratching of sharp claws against thick plywood, followed immediately by the rapid, rhythmic sound of large incisors gnawing at the air, and finally, a sharp, irritated, thunderous slap of a heavy, broad, flat tail against the floorboards. Roy's bushy gray eyebrows shot straight up toward his sweat-stained Stetson hat. "Are you seriously expecting to save a 3-generation livestock ranch with a couple of overgrown, glorified, ditch-dwelling rodents?" Claire slowly shifted her gaze from the baked, barren streambed to the endless stretches of yellowed, brittle pastures reaching all the way to the jagged horizon. In the sparse, trembling shade of an ancient, dying cottonwood tree that had dropped half its leaves back in early June just to stay alive, 2 emaciated Angus cows huddled together, their ribs showing starkly beneath their dull coats. The pathetic remnant of what had once been a proud, thriving herd of nearly 200 head. "At this exact point in my life, Roy," she said calmly, without the slightest trace of irony or hesitation, "I am fully prepared to accept help from any living creature on God's green earth that possesses strong teeth, 4 legs, and at least a minimal, honest work ethic." Roy burst into such a loud, sudden, raspy belly laugh that he had to grab the top fence wire with both hands to keep his balance. But Claire wasn't laughing. There was no room left in her life for jokes. The Bennett Creek Ranch had passed down to her from her father, Thomas, and to him from her grandfather, Arthur, who had staked out the land when the valley was still wild, open range. In the fondest memories of her early childhood, this stream had been a deep, cool, bustling artery of clear mountain runoff. Local kids used to spend long summer afternoons splashing in the deep swimming holes, catching crawdads under mossy rocks, while the cool, sub-irrigated soil fed rich, lush, emerald-green meadows that yielded tons of sweet clover and alfalfa. Her grandfather had grazed hundreds of head of prime cattle across these flats without ever worrying about forage. Her father had cut and baled mountains of high-country hay every autumn, repeating the exact same fundamental truth to her during every dry spell. Water isn't just something that comes out of a pipe, Claire. Water is our very first, our very foundation, and our most important crop. Everything else we raise or sell, the grass, the cattle, the hay, the family budget, is just a direct consequence of how well we hold on to the water. Back then, as a young girl running barefoot through the tall grass, those words had sounded like nothing more than a poetic, old-fashioned grandfatherly proverb. Now, standing amidst the dust and heat, she understood the brutal, unforgiving reality behind them. The stream hadn't died overnight. It hadn't been a sudden, dramatic catastrophe that a community could gather together to fight head-on with shovels and sandbags. It had been an agonizingly slow, insidious, exhausting process of incremental decay. With every passing spring, the winter snowpack in the distant mountains seemed just a little lighter. The spring runoff came earlier, rushed through faster, and vanished sooner. The grass turned brown and brittle a week earlier each year. The suffocating summer dust began clogging the cattle's lungs by early August instead of late September, and the ancient hand-dug rock well behind the main ranch house required more and more patience every morning just to haul up a single bucket of clear, usable water. The previous year, facing skyrocketing feed prices and dried-out stock ponds, Claire had been forced to make the painful decision to sell off 20 of her best brood cows just to buy enough overpriced winter hay to keep the rest of her herd from starving. This year, after another winter of dismal snowfall and a spring that brought no rain at all, she was left with only a handful of desperate, thin animals. If Bennett Creek dried up completely and turned into a permanent dust bowl, her remaining livestock would have to be loaded onto trucks, driven to the auction block, and sold for absolute pennies to feedlot operators. And without cattle to graze, and without water to nourish the soil, the land itself would lose all its agricultural value. Taxes would pile up, banks would foreclose, and the century-old story of the Bennett family on this land would come to a sudden, ignominious end. She had tried literally everything within her physical power and her rapidly shrinking bank account. She had spent scorching afternoons in the beating sun, patching up old, collapsed irrigation ditches with a shovel. She had hauled heavy water tanks in the back of her beaten-up Ford pickup until the truck's rear suspension groaned and snapped a leaf spring. She had personally planted dozens of bare-root willow saplings along the baked clay banks, watering them by hand with buckets, only to watch the relentless, scorching sun scorch the young leaves and wither the tender shoots faster than they could establish roots. When she finally gave in to desperation and called a commercial well drilling company out of the county seat to ask about the cost of sinking a deep industrial agricultural well, the staggering figure quoted over the phone left her utterly speechless for minutes. Wade Harper, the owner and general manager of Harper Waterworks, the largest, most aggressive water infrastructure firm in the region, had spoken to her with the smooth, condescending ease that wealthy businessmen reserve for desperate, small-time operators speaking of minor pocket change. "Claire, my dear, you really need to start thinking like a modern 21st century agricultural producer," Wade had said over the crackling phone line, his voice dripping with polished, slick charm. "Nature has simply exhausted its natural capacity in our region. The climate has shifted, the old ways are dead, and relying on surface water is a fool's errand. You need real, heavy-duty industrial engineering. You need a 600-foot deep well, a powerful multi-stage submersible electric pump, high-pressure piping, and a fully automated storage system. $70,000, base quote, and your drought problems are permanently solved. I can have my rig on your property by Monday morning if you sign the paperwork. For Claire, $70,000 might as well have been $70 million. She didn't have $70,000 in savings. She had no remaining collateral to secure another heavy bank loan, and her ranch was already mortgaged to the hilt. It was precisely at that dark moment, when quiet desperation had settled in as the constant, suffocating backdrop of her daily life, that Dr. Hannah Ortiz had entered her story. Hannah, a passionate wildlife biologist working for a regional conservation alliance, had reached out after seeing Claire's public permit application for emergency water hauling. Hannah offered an entirely different, radical perspective on the valley's water crisis, a method she called low-tech, process-based restoration, or more simply, eco-engineering using relocated nuisance beavers. Recalling her initial conversation with the biologist, Claire couldn't help but let out a bitter, quiet smirk as she watched the truck driver unbolt the crate latches. On one side of the ledger was Wade Harper's grand high-tech proposition: shining blue diesel drilling rigs, heavy machinery tearing up the landscape, sterile stainless steel pumps, a squeaky clean button-down shirt, and an astronomical debt that would guarantee her bankruptcy. On the other side was a pair of wild, unpredictable rodents rescued from an urban drainage canal where they were slated to be exterminated, accompanied by Dr. Ortiz's quiet, confident assurances. Look at this valley without your traditional agricultural blinders on for just a moment, Hannah had urged her a few weeks prior, walking alongside Claire over the hot, crunchy gravel of the dry stream bed. When the rare, heavy rainstorm actually hits these hills now, the water doesn't stay here to recharge your land. Because the creek channel has become so deeply eroded, straightened, and stripped of vegetation over decades of land clearing, the storm runoff acts like a fire hose. It surges through here in a matter of hours, carving the canyon deeper, stripping away the fertile topsoil and silt, and rushing down into the main river miles away before the earth beneath your feet ever has a chance to drink it in. Hannah had stopped, gesturing to the baked earth. Beavers don't just build wooden walls to hold back water, Claire. They are master hydrologists. They build complex networks of leaky, flexible dams that create broad, shallow impoundments. They slow the water down, spread it out across the entire floodplain, and force it to sink deep into the surrounding soil. They literally act as biological sponges, artificially raising the underground water table for hundreds of yards around their ponds. And best of all, they work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, completely for free. All they ask for in return is some soft wood and to be left alone. And so, here they were. The heavy pine crates were finally unlatched and pulled open. When the animals finally emerged, they certainly did not look like glorious, legendary saviors of a dying western ranch. They were heavy, rotund, somewhat awkward creatures covered in dense, dark brown fur that was clotted with sawdust from the transport crates. The larger of the two, a massive male weighing easily 50 pounds, sat motionless inside the dark crate for several long, tense minutes, blinking his small, dark eyes against the harsh sunlight, as if carefully weighing the legalities and wisdom of his sudden, forced relocation. Finally, with a heavy, waddling gait, he lumbered out onto the dry ground, let out a soft, grunting snort, slapped his broad tail with a loud thwack against the baked mud, and waddled with utter indifference straight toward the nearest, nastiest, mud-choked puddle in the creek channel. His smaller mate followed closely behind him, completely ignoring the small crowd of humans watching from the bank. The first full week of the Beaver experiment was an agonizing, nerve-wracking ordeal that nearly pushed Claire to the brink of throwing in the towel. The two new furry inhabitants set to work not with the majestic, elegant precision Claire had naively envisioned, but with a chaotic, relentless, and seemingly indiscriminate energy that appeared almost entirely destructive. Their very first project on the property was not to build a dam across the dry channel, but to gnaw completely through the trunks of 3 young, beautiful native willow trees that Claire had spent 2 grueling years watering, fencing, and nurturing by hand. To make matters worse, 2 nights later, the pair discovered a neat pile of untreated wooden fence posts that Claire had laboriously hauled down to the creek bank for an upcoming repair project. By the next morning, half of those expensive, hand-cut pine posts had been systematically dragged down into the muddy ditch, stripped of their bark, and crammed haphazardly into a mess of weeds. Roy practically made a full-time job out of leaning over his side of the boundary fence, offering a colorful running commentary on every fresh disaster. "Hey there, Claire!" Roy shouted across the road one morning, watching her inspect the chewed stump of her favorite willow. "Have your new highly trained engineering consultants finished up their cost estimates yet? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your chief foreman just took a union break after felling the absolute last piece of shade you had left on this entire 40 acres. At the local farm supply store in town, news of Claire's unusual project spread like wildfire, making her the reluctant center of endless teasing and jokes over morning coffee. Local farmers and ranchers, raised on traditional methods of ditch clearing and land management, chuckled openly while passing around rumors about the Great Bennett Beaver Farm. A photo even began circulating on local social media pages, showing Claire standing knee-deep in slippery black mud, stubbornly wrapping heavy wire mesh around the base of an old cottonwood trunk, while one of the beavers calmly floated past her in a muddy pool, clutching a leafy branch in its teeth like a cigar. Yet, despite the public ridicule and her own mounting anxieties, by the late days of the second week, the cruel jokes began to quiet down, gradually replaced by a strange, quiet sense of curiosity and astonishment. While the local townsfolk were busy laughing, something quiet, ancient, and utterly remarkable was taking place along the dry bed of Bennett Creek. Working exclusively under the cover of dark, moonlit nights, the Beaver pair had taken those chewed willow branches, the stolen fence posts, clumps of thick river mud, heavy river stones, and handfuls of uprooted turf, weaving them into a seemingly haphazard, messy but remarkably resilient structure. They had built their very first primary dam right across a narrow pinch point in the streambed. When a sudden, brief summer downpour swept over the valley late one Tuesday night, the outcome was dramatically different from anything Claire had seen in over a decade. In past years, that rainwater would have flashed through the dry ditch in less than 2 hours, leaving behind nothing but deeper gullies and dried mud. But this time, as the mountain runoff swept down the channel, it ran straight into the newly constructed barrier. The dam didn't break, it held. The water slowed down, backed up, and spread out. When Claire walked down to the creek early the following morning, she stopped dead in her tracks, her mouth falling open. Spreading out behind the wooden dam was a wide, smooth, tranquil pond of water, nearly 40 feet across and 3 feet deep at its center. The water was no longer rushing away, it was resting quietly. Claire knelt down at the water's edge and pushed her fingers into the soil. The ground along the banks was no longer hard as concrete. It was soft, cool, and thoroughly saturated. The moisture was creeping outward, soaking deep into the surrounding earth for yards in every direction. Within less than a week, the transformation accelerated at a breathtaking pace. Along the newly saturated waterline, bright green, tender shoots of sedge, cattails, and wild grasses began aggressively pushing their way up through the pale, dry crust of the soil. The harsh, dusty smell of baked dirt and dying vegetation that had defined the ranch for months was suddenly replaced by the rich, clean, unmistakable fragrance of living mud, fresh water, and blooming green life. Claire's remaining cows didn't need to be driven. They abandoned their traditional spot near the empty, rusty stock tank and began wandering down to the creek multiple times a day, standing knee-deep in the cool, clean water, drinking their fill and grazing contentedly on the lush, tender green shoots sprouting along the newly formed wetland margins. Overcome with a sudden mixture of pride, relief, and validation, Claire pulled her smartphone out of her back pocket, recorded a short, unedited video of the pond, cleared her dry throat, and spoke directly into the camera lens. "You folks back in town can laugh and crack jokes all you want," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion as she panned the camera across the sparkling water. "But this exact section of Bennett Creek hasn't held a single drop of water past June in over 15 long years. Right now, I'm standing beside a broad, deep pond. My pasture banks are turning bright green again, and my 2 new furry engineers are working night shifts without taking a single dime of my money." She uploaded the raw video clip to her personal social media page that afternoon. By the time night fell, the short video had gathered tens of thousands of views across the state. By the following morning, Claire's phone was ringing off the hook with calls from regional conservationists, outdoor enthusiasts, curious neighboring landowners, and journalists from state agricultural newspapers. However, Claire's sudden viral success and the rapid recovery of her stream did not go unnoticed by those whose lucrative business models depended entirely on farmers remaining desperate, helpless, and reliant on expensive industrial interventions. A mere 3 days after the video went viral, the smooth, quiet hum of a powerful engine signaled the arrival of a pristine, metallic blue, heavy-duty pickup truck pulling into Claire's dusty gravel driveway. Wade Harper stepped out of the air-conditioned cab wearing a pair of immaculate, custom-fitted dark denim jeans, polished ostrich skin boots, and a snow-white button-down shirt. He looked less like a local contractor and more like a slick politician stepping straight off a high-budget campaign commercial. "Claire," Wade began, strolling casually toward the edge of the newly formed pond, his hands tucked loosely into his front pockets as he scanned the water with a heavy expression of polite, calculated condescension. "I see you've really thrown yourself wholeheartedly into these trendy little biological experiments. It makes for a wonderful, feel-good story on the evening news. I'll certainly give you that." He stopped near the edge of the dam, using the toe of his expensive boot to lightly nudge a pile of beaver-chewed sticks. "But let's be completely honest with ourselves here, as mature adults running real businesses," Wade continued, turning his dazzling white smile toward her. "These are wild rodents, Claire. Unpredictable, destructive vermin. In a matter of months, if you don't stop them, they will fell every single shade tree you have left on this property. They'll cause unpredictable flooding across your low pastures, destroy your boundary fences, and turn this entire bottomland into a stagnant, muddy swamp, breeding millions of disease-carrying mosquitoes and toxic bacteria. Real water management, my dear, is a precise, controlled engineering science. It's not a job you hand over to wild animals." Claire stepped forward, standing her ground firmly on the muddy bank, her hands resting on her hips. Her work boots were covered in dried silt, her canvas pants were stained with clay, and she met his polished gaze without flinching. "So far, Wade," she said, her voice dropping to an icy, lethal calm. "Those two wild rodents have accomplished more real, lasting good for this land and for my livestock in 3 short weeks than your $70,000 engineering sales pitch ever could. And they didn't ask me to sign away my ranch to pay for it." Harper's dazzling smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening as his eyes narrowed into a cold, hard glare. "Just make sure that cheap little shortcut doesn't end up costing you everything you own, Claire," he warned softly, his voice losing its slick charm and taking on a sharp, dangerous edge. "When that sloppy pile of sticks inevitably blows out during the first real autumn storm and floods the public county road or damages Roy's property downstream, the legal liability claims and environmental fines will cost you a hell of a lot more than drilling a proper well would have." From that exact day forward, dark, oppressive clouds began systematically gathering over Bennett Creek. Within days, suspicious, anonymous posts began surfacing across local community message boards and agricultural groups. The posts claimed that the Beaver reintroduction project was secretly contaminating the local watershed, spreading dangerous pathogens to nearby farms, and causing cattle on surrounding properties to fall mysteriously ill from drinking stagnant water. Other rumors asserted that the unpermitted wetland project threatened the ecological balance of the entire county and was driving down surrounding land values. The campaign of whispers had an immediate, chilling effect. Several local farmers who had previously expressed genuine interest in visiting Claire's property to learn how to implement similar low-cost restoration projects on their own dry creeks suddenly canceled their planned visits, offering vague, uncomfortable excuses. More devastatingly, the head chef and purchasing agent for a high-end farm-to-table restaurant in the city, who had been consistently purchasing grass-fed beef from Claire for over 3 years, called her to state that he was placing all future meat orders on hold indefinitely, citing a needing to thoroughly investigate health and safety rumors regarding the water supply on the ranch. Claire felt the familiar, suffocating grip of despair closing in around her throat once again. She was exhausted, financially drained, and deeply hurt by the betrayal of her own community. But her longtime friend Marcy, along with Dr. Hannah Ortiz, refused to let her retreat into isolation. Vicious rumors thrive in the dark, but they completely evaporate when exposed to cold, hard facts, Hannah declared passionately during an emergency meeting around Claire's kitchen table. "We aren't going to hide, Claire. We are going to do the exact opposite. We are going to host an official, fully transparent, open creek day. We'll invite the official county environmental inspectors, the regional water board, all your neighbors, and the local news media. We will perform live, open water quality testing right in front of their eyes. Show them the heavy-duty protective wire mesh we've wrapped around your mature trees, and let everyone see the real health of this ecosystem with their own eyes." The entire team threw themselves into preparations with incredible urgency. Claire spent long days clearing safe walking trails along the creek banks, putting up educational posters, and mounting large wooden display boards featuring dramatic before and after photographs showing the miraculous greening of the valley. The day of the public tour arrived under a clear, blazing sky, and to everyone's surprise, nearly 50 people showed up, including a dozen skeptical local landowners and a camera crew from the regional television station. The event unfolded with astonishing success. Even the usually shy beavers seemed to understand the stakes. Right in front of the gathered crowds and rolling news cameras, the pair glided effortlessly across the glassy surface of the main pond, carrying leafy willow branches in their jaws to deposit them neatly on the crest of the dam. The children in attendance cheered with delight, while even the oldest, most hardened farming skeptics leaned over the water, watching in quiet fascination. When Dr. Ortiz conducted the live water quality tests, taking samples from both the incoming stream above the pond and the water flowing out below the main dam, the scientific results were indisputable. The water exiting the beaver pond was dramatically clearer, and contained far lower levels of sediment and agricultural nitrates than the water entering it. The broad, slow-moving impoundment was acting as a massive, natural biological filtration system, trapping suspended silt and purifying the water as it flowed through. The following morning, regional newspapers ran glowing front-page feature stories with bold headlines. Nature's Engineers: How Beavers Are Bringing Bennett Creek Back to Life. For the very first time, Wade Harper's carefully crafted corporate image in the county suffered a massive public blow. Yet, Claire's sense of victory proved to be painfully short-lived. The true, devastating blow was waiting for her on the very eve of the official county licensing board's final vote to permanently approve her restoration permit. Claire woke abruptly to the frantic, distressed lowing of her cows long before the first light of dawn broke over the eastern horizon. The sound was not the calm, rhythmic vocalization of her herd. It was a high-pitched, desperate cry of fear and confusion. Instantly, her heart sank into her stomach like a lead weight. Throwing on a heavy flannel jacket and pulling on her mud boots, she grabbed a high-powered flashlight and ran out into the chilly morning darkness, her old farm dog June barking anxiously at her heels. When she reached the creek bank, the beam of her flashlight swept across a scene of utter destruction and heartbreak. The heavy, temporary wooden fencing that had been constructed to keep the cattle away from the sensitive, muddy banks of the upper pond had been violently torn apart, smashed, and dragged out of the ground. Driven by fear and confusion, several of her panicked cows were standing knee-deep in the thick, treacherous mud of the primary bank, their heavy hooves trampling and destroying the soft earth embankment. But the most horrific damage lay at the center of the water channel. The primary beaver dam, the glorious, labor-intensive structure that had taken weeks of tireless work to build and refine, had been savagely breached right through its main structural core. The vast volume of water that had accumulated over weeks of slow, miraculous recovery was violently escaping through a wide, jagged gash in the center of the wall. The roaring, muddy torrent was tearing away tons of accumulated silt, washing out deep-rooted bank vegetation, and ruthlessly scouring the streambed down to bare, gouged rock. A tender young willow tree that had finally taken firm root near the water's edge lay snapped completely at its base, crushed under the rush of water and debris. "No, no, please, God, no!" Claire cried out in a strangled sob, dropping her flashlight into the grass as she scrambled wildly down the slippery bank to drive her terrified, stuck animals out of the rising mud. By 8 o'clock that morning, the chief county environmental inspector arrived at the scene in response to an urgent, anonymous early morning report of severe soil erosion on the property. Standing on the muddy, gouged bank and staring down at the ruined, silt-laden water rushing through the shattered dam, the inspector looked at Claire with a grim, deeply disappointed expression and slowly shook his head. "Claire, on a personal level, I am truly sorry for what happened here," the inspector said, adjusting his hard hat with a heavy sigh. "But looking at this mess in my official capacity, I simply cannot sign off on approving this permit. This isn't controlled ecological restoration. This is an unmanaged, dangerous hazard that poses an immediate risk of downstream erosion and sediment pollution. I have no choice but to issue a temporary suspension order." When the inspector's vehicle finally drove away down the gravel road, Claire's legs gave out. She sank down right into the cold, sticky black mud beside the ruined remnants of the dam. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably from sheer physical exhaustion and emotional shock. June, her faithful dog, walked up silently and pressed his cold, wet nose against her muddy shoulder, letting out a soft, whimpering whine. For the very first time since her father had passed away in the hospital 3 years ago, Claire completely lost her composure. She buried her face in her dirt-stained hands and wept, silently, bitterly, helplessly listening to the tragic sound of her stream's lifeblood draining away into the parched, ungrateful earth. It was precisely at that agonizing moment that the low, unmistakable rumble of a heavy V8 engine sounded from the road. The metallic blue pickup pulled up onto the shoulder once again. Wade Harper climbed down from the cab, stepping carefully around the mud puddles in his clean boots. He walked toward her, holding a styrofoam coffee cup, making a clumsy attempt to hide a triumphant, smug smirk behind a hastily constructed mask of grave concern. "Claire, I just heard the terrible news over the scanner," Wade said, his voice dripping with insincere sympathy. "This is absolutely tragic. Truly, my heart goes out to you. But I warned you right from the start, didn't I? Wild nature is completely unpredictable and unmanageable. A pile of sticks and mud will never, ever be a proper substitute for real, professional hydraulic engineering. Look, my drilling crew is currently sitting idle at the shop. I can have my main rig parked on your property by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and we can start drilling that well immediately. I'll even offer you a 10% courtesy discount on the contract." Claire slowly stopped crying. She wiped her eyes with the back of her muddy arm and stood up out of the dirt, rising to her full height. As she stared at Harper, the overwhelming grief and despair inside her chest rapidly evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp, burning rage that flared like a strike-anywhere match. "That dam didn't just collapse on its own from water pressure, Wade," she said, her voice shaking with quiet intensity. "The main structural support logs were pulled outward against the current, and my cows didn't somehow learn how to unlatch a heavy iron chain gate by themselves in the middle of the night." Harper's face darkened, his brow furrowing into an exaggerated, offended scowl. "You need to be extremely careful about making wild, slanderous accusations, Claire," he grunted, taking a step back. "Extreme stress makes desperate people see conspiracies that simply don't exist." But Claire was no longer paying any attention to his words. Her keen, sharp eyes, trained by a lifetime of tracking lost cattle through the brush, had drifted downward to the soft, wet clay running along the narrow service dirt track that paralleled the creek bank. There, deeply and cleanly pressed into the fresh mud wall of the drainage ditch, ran two fresh, unmistakable sets of heavy tire tracks. The aggressive, knobby tread pattern of a light, high-performance, all-terrain vehicle. And in that blinding flash of clarity, Claire remembered something vital. 1 month ago, following a series of predatory coyote attacks on local calves, she and Marcy had purchased and installed 2 high-definition, night-vision hidden trail cameras. One had been pointed directly at the main cattle pen. The second camera, carefully disguised inside a dense cluster of artificial leaves and mounted high up in the thick branches of an ancient oak tree, was aimed straight down at the main bend of the creek, covering the entire expanse of the primary beaver dam. Without uttering another single word to Wade Harper, Claire turned her back on him, whistled for her dog, and walked with deliberate, purposeful steps toward the ranch house. Less than an hour later, Claire, Marcy, and Dr. Hannah Ortiz were huddled tightly around the glowing screen of a laptop sitting on the wooden kitchen table. The high-definition, infrared night vision video recording was astonishingly sharp and clear. The timestamp in the lower corner of the screen read precisely 2:17 a.m. Into the quiet, dark frame came the muted glow of a single LED headlight from an approaching quad bike. A large figure wearing a heavy dark work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes climbed off the machine. The man walked deliberately over to the cattle pen, unhooked the heavy iron chain latch, and swung the gate wide open. He then pulled a long steel crowbar and a heavy garden rake from the rack of his quad bike and walked straight over to the primary beaver dam. With cold, methodical, ruthless efficiency, the man began driving the steel bar deep into the delicate structure, ruthlessly tearing out the primary anchor branches that held the dam together, kicking the debris downstream with his heavy boots to accelerate the washout. To finish his sabotage, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a large bag of sweet molasses cattle feed, and scattered it heavily along the fragile, muddy banks, ensuring that the loose cows would be drawn straight to the breach to trample the remaining earth. As the night saboteur finally paused his destruction to wipe his forehead, he turned his body directly toward the oak tree. The powerful, invisible infrared illuminator of the hidden camera struck his face, perfectly illuminating every single feature of his visage in sharp, high-contrast detail. It was Wade Harper. The silence inside Claire's kitchen was so absolute that the only sound in the room was the slow, steady, rhythmic ticking of the ancient brass clock hanging on the wall. And then, entirely unexpected even to herself, a short, breathless laugh escaped Claire's lips. It wasn't a laugh of amusement or joy. It was the sudden, overwhelming release of a person who had spent months carrying an impossible, suffocating weight, only to feel it vanish in a single second. "What an absolute, arrogance-blinded idiot you are, Wade," she whispered softly to the glowing screen. By 12 o'clock noon, a digital copy of the video file had been officially handed over to both the county sheriff's department and the chief environmental inspector. By 5 o'clock that evening, the lead investigative reporter for the state news network had published the full, unedited video footage online, alongside a brief, devastating headline that exploded across the internet. Framed by the competition, local businessman caught on camera destroying beaver dam to force landowner into $70,000 contract. The public scandal erupted across the entire state with unprecedented, overwhelming force. Public outrage was immediate and ferocious. A massive wave of fierce public backlash hit Harper Waterworks like a tidal wave. Within 24 hours, state regulatory agencies launched comprehensive audits into Harper's business practices, uncovering a string of previous suspicious incidents where small landholders had suffered sudden, unexplained infrastructure failures shortly after declining Harper's expensive services. State officials also discovered that the wave of anonymous online smear posts had been traced directly to IP addresses originating inside Harper Waterworks' corporate headquarters. Wade Harper's slick, carefully constructed business empire collapsed overnight. Before the week was out, county prosecutors officially filed multiple felony charges against him, including criminal destruction of private property, felony animal cruelty, illegal tampering with public watersheds, and creating a severe environmental hazard. Yet, the most miraculous transformation occurred back on the banks of Bennett Creek itself. On the morning following the news report, a long line of pickup trucks began pulling up onto the gravel shoulder near Claire's property. Dozens of local citizens, small business owners, and neighboring farmers arrived unannounced. They didn't ask for permission, and they didn't ask for pay. They simply brought their own shovels, heavy work gloves, buckets, and construction materials. Roy was among the very first to arrive, hauling a large flatbed trailer packed to the brim with high-grade, pressure-treated lumber to completely rebuild Claire's destroyed boundary fences. Neighboring ranchers who had spent weeks cracking jokes about Claire's furry rodents stood shoulder to shoulder in the mud alongside environmental volunteers, quietly and efficiently helping to clear away ruined mud, shore up eroded banks, and lay down heavy protective rock barriers. But the absolute crowning achievement of the restoration was executed by the true masters of the craft. Working over 3 consecutive nights of furious, non-stop, tireless labor, the Beaver pair did not merely repair the broken breach. Driven by their incredible, innate biological instincts, they rebuilt the primary dam significantly higher, wider, and immensely stronger than it had been before. They packed the damaged core with heavy river stones, thick mud, and fresh, resilient willow logs, weaving the structure so tightly into the surrounding bedrock that no human force, short of an excavator, could ever tear it down again. When the chief county inspector finally returned to the ranch 2 weeks later to conduct his mandatory follow-up evaluation, he didn't find a ruined, muddy hazard. Instead, he stepped out onto the bank to behold a magnificent, thriving, vibrant ecological wetland sanctuary. The water backed up behind the massive main dam had turned crystal clear, reflecting the deep blue of the western sky. Lush, emerald green grasses, wild mint, and thick sedges were carpeted along the wide, stable banks. And most miraculous of all, when Claire lowered a weighted measuring line down into her family's ancient, hand-dug rock well behind the main house that morning, the static water level had risen by more than 2 full feet, the highest level recorded on the Bennett Creek Ranch in over 25 years. Without uttering a single word, the inspector pulled out his official registry book, flipped to the final page, and stamped his official, permanent regulatory approval across every single permit document. Claire stood on the crest of the hill overlooking her valley as the sun began its slow descent behind the western mountains, painting the sky in deep shades of gold, amber, and purple. Down in the broad, sparkling expanse of the new main pond, a subtle ripple broke the glassy surface of the water as a dark, round head surfaced smoothly, swimming toward a thick stand of green willows. Claire rested her hand on the wooden fence post, listening to the cool, soft murmur of living water flowing gently over the dam, and knew in her heart that the Bennett family had finally come home.